We're so glad that you're joining me today. We are going to now take a journey into one of the great men in our series called the Healing Evangelist. We are going to be covering Oral Roberts and Lester Sumrall and Charles and Francis Hunter and F.F. Bosworth and George Jeffreys. So today we're going to look into the life and the ministry and the personality of one of my favorites, Dr. Lester Sumrall. I must first tell you that I knew him personally and counted him as my spiritual father over my life, so I've spent a lot of time with him toward the end of his life. But today we're going to go start from the beginning and the rise and how God trained him and used him to become one of the great spiritual fathers of our time. He at one time had over 3,000 different ministers that related to him, I was told, as he would give counsel and prayer and covering and all the things that a father would need to do to his spiritual sons and daughters. And I would have to say, as a son, he did well. Everything that he told me to not to do turned out exactly the way that he said it would be. And if I didn't do what he said, I found out real fast that he was right and I had a mess on my hands. So I only went through one of those, and after that, I took his word and did my best to obey him to the best of my ability. Lester Sumrall's life begins when he was born on February the 15th in 1913 at 8 a.m. in the morning in New Orleans, Louisiana. He would end his life on April the 28th, 1996 in South Bend, Indiana at the age of 83. So we're going to journey through a man's 83 years of life. How he came to God and how God trained him and developed him and how he responded. Not everybody responds to the dealings of God. Sometimes when God deals with people, they only go so far, or they don't want to deal with it at that time, or it's too much of a cost in the price that one must pay to carry God's commanding power in the earth. So we're going to journey with him. Brother Sumrall's family was a very interesting family. He said that his father was a good sinner, a good Baptist sinner, that he would get up and go to church and then come home and act like the devil, and there was trouble there. And so he, as a child growing up, he kind of took after his father's disposition. His father's name was George Sumrall. He is reported as being a hard worker, and he had big muscles. And so he took great pride in the muscles that he had and the ability that he could fight and win, and that nobody could ever overpower him. So as a young child, Lester Sumrall would look at his dad and say, I want to be like my dad, and took on the mindset and the disposition. And his dad didn't like preachers. Now, his mother, whose name was Betty Sumrall, was the exact opposite. She loved the Lord. She loved going to church. She loved praying. And she's a part of a ladies' prayer group that worked very actively in the community of praying for people and visiting people. And so what happened at Sumrall's home, when the preacher would come, because their home was more of a bigger home, the pastor would ask for the guest preacher and his family to stay in their home, which meant, according to young Lester, meant that he had to give up his bedroom and his bed to the pastor's family or the pastor's kids and sleep on a cot or on some blankets on the floor. So he didn't like that. He didn't like that every time a preacher came to be at the church, end up at his house, they eat his food, sleep in his bed, and didn't like it. And he would tell the story that sometimes he would treat the people that had come to visit their children, the PK, the preacher's kids, very meanly and very roughly. He didn't like them, so he was rough to them and would beat them up and do mean things. Like one time he got one of the pastor's sons and poured molasses and flour in their hair and rubbed it in. They finally had to cut all the hair off of that young little boy to get rid of all the trouble. So that you can kind of see that Lester Sumrall was an aggressive little boy, and he took on the disposition of his dad and did not like the preachers, didn't like the folks that came into his house. May I make a comment? So many times preachers' kids and people in the ministry don't treat their kids right, and you have to be careful that you don't make the child feel like they're second class. It should be an honor to have someone in your home and to have the hospitality for them, and not always a struggle or a strain. So it's how you set things up, how you teach and how you work it together makes your home life more conducive to being a person that can have guest in your home and your family likes it and it's not a problem. For some reason, because mama liked it and daddy didn't, there was a conflict in the childhood home of Lester Sumrall. In his childhood growing up, there was miracles that he saw. So he did have a knowledge of God and aware that God would do things. One time his father got injured at work and could not work, and they didn't have enough money for food. And Lester's mother would go in and make the table and put the plates, the forks and food and everything down, and they'd all sit down and they'd pray and ask God to bless the food. And he goes, every time there'd be a knock at the door, somebody be bringing some food over to help the Sumrall family. He said, I saw God supply our needs. That happened multiple times during that crisis time. There was no money, but faith set the table. They prayed, and while they were praying, the knock on the door would come, and God supplied. So he saw that growing up, and then he himself was sick with a disease when he was little, and they got the ladies' prayer group. You know, back in those days, ladies' prayer groups, when you read church history, they're all through it. These lady prayer groups come around and they appear and they attack and they pray and they get miracles. And so when little Lester was sick and couldn't eat, was in severe pain, Mama called the ladies' prayer group, and guess what? They came over and prayed over him and got little Lester healed. So he experienced God's healing power even when he didn't like to be around preachers. Then the third thing that happened when he was a child that he speaks of was that his mom, Betty, had a cancerous growth on her breast. And in those days, they didn't have all the different type of medical cures or even how to help people. So if there was a cancer in your breast, you had to remove the whole thing. And so during the night, she had a dream that Jesus walked into her bedroom and looked toward her and healed her. She got up that morning and she was getting ready for the morning breakfast and the morning family to eat at the table. She came and said, I had a dream last night that Jesus came to my house and he healed me. So she went into the bedroom to take off the gauze. And when she took off the gauze, the cancer had fallen off into the gauze, and where it was on her breast was gone, and it was perfect, beautiful skin. God had delivered her from that cancer of the breast right there in one night. And Lester Sumrall was right there in the home to see all of that. Well, you may have a resistance to preachers. You may have a problem with ministers and things, but when you keep seeing God do things in your house, God do things for your mom and provide for the whole family, there's a deposit. Those experiences become a part of your makeup, your personality, of what you will be in the future. And so Brother Sumrall was not a person that grew up without the knowledge of God. He just grew up in a home that had conflict in it. Daddy didn't like it, and Mama liked it. And so kids took choices. That's why parents have to be together in their decisions and how they do what they do, so there is not a division, because when a house is divided, it shall fall. And so we don't want your personal house to fall. We don't want your ministry house to fall or your business house to fall. So there has to be a unified cooperating spirit for it to work in a beautiful way. Now, when Lester Sumrall was 17 years old, he was at one of the most worst times of his life. He contracted TB, or tuberculosis, when he was 17 years old. And so that meant he had to go to bed. That meant he couldn't go out and play. In the beginning, when he began to cough up blood and his friends saw it, he kind of used it as a means to terrorize them and go at them. But you can't, when something's working in your body, it'll eventually take over some degree of dominion over your activity. TB was a killer in those days. Well, Mama called for the lady prayer group to come there and pray. And this is very interesting. Oral Roberts said this, and Sumrall will say this too. Brother Roberts would be one of those that would say, the doctors knew that they wanted to help me. The Christians came and they would say, Lord, if it be thy will. They said the doctors knew what the will was and the Christians didn't. Sumrall's experience was the same thing. That they would come to pray for him and they would pray, God, if it be your will, heal little Lester and raise him up. But if not, prepare his soul to go to the other side. Well, when you pray a prayer like that in a 17-year-old's mind, and it doesn't go over. He didn't like them. He would curse them under his breath. He thought they were ugly and mean and didn't like them at all. Lester Sumrall was dying at 17. One night, God came to visit him. God's a visitor. He's a guest that comes without much notice. He just appears at any time he likes to appear, morning, noon, or night, while you're eating, sleeping, or talking. When he wants to talk to you, he interrupts your life. He interrupts Lester Sumrall, 17-year-old dying with a vision. His first vision in life was on one side of his bed where he was lying was an open casket, very large and very big, an open casket. On the other side, he had an open Bible, and God said, pick one. Well, my friends, that's a hard choice for a 17-year-old to pick one. He didn't want to preach, but he didn't want to die. He didn't want either one of those things, but he had to pick one. I want to go to a clip now and let Lester Sumrall tell you for himself what happened as he saw the vision of the open Bible and the open casket and his miracle healing.
I was lying there in a kind of a coma, and the doctor came in and he tried to get a pulse, and there wasn't any. He tried to get a drop of blood, and he couldn't find any. He put his instruments all over my chest, and he looked at my parents and says, there's no sign of life in the boy. He says, I'm sure he'll be dead in 2 hours. Doctors usually know about how long you're going to live. And this good family doctor, he slightly missed it, you see, because that was 500,000 hours ago. And he's been dead himself for 300,000 or 400,000 hours. So actually, it's not what man says about you. It's what God says. If God says live, you can live. And if God don't say live, you can die. But in that moment, I saw a vision of a coffin on one side of me, and I said, in my spirit, I could feel that God was saying, that's yours. And I said, I don't like the looks of that. And I'm too young to get into a coffin. And I turned my head, and there was a big Bible on the wall, open. And God said, if you preach, I'll let you live. I said, I don't want to preach. I don't like preachers anyway. And I turned my head, and there was a coffin. God said, in 2 hours, you'll be there. That's yours.
He was given a choice of dying or preaching. Lester Sumrall made the decision that would not only save his own life, but also change the lives of countless people over the following 6.5 decades.
So I turned my head back to the wall, and there was that Bible open. God said, if you don't preach, that's your coffin. And something happened that I don't believe any preacher in history has ever been able to define. On the inside of me, down deep inside of me, I suddenly said, Lord, I'm sorry for my rebellion. I was wrong. I'm sorry for my sins. Would you forgive me of my sins? Would you cleanse me? And if you will do that, I will serve you. And God said, Bible, will you preach? I said, I'll be a servant. I'll do anything you ask me to do. And I dropped off to sleep. My family stood around to watch me die because the doctor said I'd be gone in 2 hours. And the next morning, when I opened my eyes, there was my mother looking down upon me, very carefully looking to see if I was still alive, And I looked up and I said, Mother, I'm going to be a preacher. And she knew I was going to die. She knew I was full of the devil, but she didn't know I'd been born again that night and that a new nature had come inside of me. The mystery of salvation took place that I can't understand. I just suddenly don't lie anymore, don't steal anymore. I just suddenly had a great change that took place on the inside of me, and I was a new creature in Christ Jesus.
When he came out of that vision, he shocked his mother as he said, I want to eat what my daddy ate. I want to eat what he ate. I'm tired of drinking grape juice. I had enough of it for my life, because in those days, that's what you gave, I guess, these sick patients. Just drink little juice, little things like that. And so he was sick of grape juice. So he ate a big Southern country breakfast. Now, some of you that don't know what that means you've got bacon and sausage and eggs and grits and biscuits and gravy and all those wonderful things together and eat it. And mother was kind of concerned, I don't know if I want to give him all of that, because he's only drinking grape juice. If he eats all that, he might die. Well, he's going to die anyway, so let him have his last meal and be happy. She laid it down in his room and he ate it, and she walked out and came back a few moments later, and the plate was clean and all the food was gone. And she goes, "Where'd the food go?" And he went, "In here." And he said, "I want more." And God healed him that day because he chose the call of God. He chose the open Bible. But in his heart, he didn't want it. He just didn't want to die. And so after his strength came back to him and he became a strong young man again, the Lord tapped him on the shoulder a few weeks later and said, "Didn't you tell me you were going to preach for me?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I guess I did." He said, "Well, I think it's about time you start." And so Brother Sumrall went to the breakfast table in a couple of days and told his dad that he was going to go be a preacher, and his dad cursed him and hit the table with his fist and made foul languages at him and said, "You'll die, and don't you leave until I get back from work." Lester Sumrall went upstairs and packed his bag and began his ministerial career with a friend in an old car that didn't run too well. He went out to preach in small country areas where we have one-room schoolhouses or in barns, maybe a little church once in a while, mainly in schoolhouses. He avoided the city. He didn't want to be around the preachers and all the big stuff. So he went out there and he said, "I preached to stay alive. I didn't preach to get people saved. I didn't care. I didn't care if they went to hell. I didn't care if they went to heaven. I was just preaching to stay alive, because the only thing that I knew was that I was sick and God healed me." He said, "When I did go to church, I was always writing notes to the little girls in the church, so I didn't always hear the sermon, but I knew a few things about church." He said, "But I didn't care." He said, "I got up and told them I had to preach to stay alive, and if you want Christ, you can have him, and da-da-da, and walk out the door." He didn't have a heart. He didn't love the people. He didn't really love God. He was just preaching to stay alive. Can you believe that this young man that would be one of the great generals of the time be able to come to the people as a young man and get up and talk and say, "I don't like you. I don't care. I'm just preaching to stay alive"? Something would have to happen in his heart. The second vision that Lester Sumrall would have would change his whole life and change his heart. I want to take you now to a time where he tells this vision of watching humanity trot down a road and fall into the lake of fire. Here's Brother Sumrall telling you the vision that changed his life.
One night in quite a large schoolhouse about 12 miles out of Dyersburg, Tennessee, we had 300 or 400 people in the auditorium. And I was sitting on the side, and suddenly I had another song leader, and he was leading, but I didn't see him. I saw thousands of Japanese. I said, I was seeing a vision and didn't know it, I said, "Isn't that beautiful?" Then I saw Chinese, Mongolians, Manchurians, Tibetans. They were so beautiful, all dressed in their natural garb. Indians, Africans, South Americans, Europeans, millions. And they were all going the same way. And I was fascinated with it. And then I saw a big curve leaving this. I asked God what this was. He says, "That's the road of life, and everybody's on it." He says, "That is the road of life." He says, "Nobody goes that way. Everybody goes this way." So I said, "Well, all right." Then I saw a big curve off the road, and a few million of them were getting off the main road. I said, "Well, where are they going?" And the Lord says, "That's the saints. They're going to heaven, off the road of life, they're going into heaven, singing. You hear them singing? Singing and praising. But he kept me right above the mainstream of life here. And suddenly we came to the end of it. And there was a precipice there. And below was the lake of fire. And I could see it. And when the people of life got to the end of the road of life and saw that they were damned, the lake of fire was there, they began to blaspheme. Like thunder, like thunder. And then they began to pull their hair out by the roots. They began to claw their faces till blood squirted and curse terribly. And then they hit the lake of fire, went straight under, and never came back. They were gone forever. And that place, you couldn't see them anymore. And then there came more and more. And I said, God, you shouldn't show me this. I don't like it. He says, the reason you don't like it is because you're to blame for it. And I said, no. This was all in that vision. I said, I don't know those people. How can I be blamed for those people in Africa? I've never seen them. How can I be blamed for the people in Japan? I've never seen them. And God quoted to me from Ezekiel 3, chapter 3, verses 17, 18, and 19. If the ungodly commits his ungodly deeds and he dies in his ungodliness, he shall perish. But if you do not warn the ungodly of his ungodly deeds, I will require his blood at your hands. And I saw blood running through all my fingers. I said, take it away. Take it away. Take it away. God said, I cannot take it away. I said, who can take it away? He said, you. I said, what do you mean? He says, if you do not warn the ungodly of his ungodly deeds, he said, you have to go to Japan. I'd never dreamed of that. You have to go to China, Korea, Manchuria, Tibet. Says, I don't even like the people in Tennessee. I want to go to Florida. I want to go back home, stay home. But the Lord didn't respond to that, because the Lord never responds to stupidity. And I waited there, and he said, to be in my will, you must go and warn those people of their sins. You're not responsible to save them. I save them. But you have to warn them and let them become conscious of their sins. I laid on when I came back out of the vision, everybody went home. The farmers that all left took the lantern with them. My song leader, he went with them and left. I don't know why. Never one of them ever spoke to me about that night. I was sitting in a schoolhouse without one bit of light, in solid darkness, thinking Chinese, Japanese, Mongolians. What am I going to do? And God spoke to me and said, you have to love those people. I don't know how. He says, I can put love in your heart. And God that night caused me to love all the peoples of the world.
Brother Sumrall was moved tremendously by that vision, and his heart changed toward the world. Every one of us has to have a touch of God to move us toward greater compassion and greater perception of the people that we minister to. And when he had that vision of humanity falling into the lake of fire, and that God was holding him accountable for many of those people around the world, his heart changed and he became a worldwide missionary, but he hadn't gone anyplace yet. But then walks into his life a man that is significant and is of great importance, and that is Howard Carter. Now, Howard Carter to you and I may not be a very important name, but it's a very important name in Sumrall's life and in the life of the Pentecostal revival in the early 1900s. Howard Carter was a British guy. His father was very smart. I'll say it this way, he comes from a very smart family. His father was the one that made the bells in St. Paul's Cathedral or chapel there in London. When you hear the bells ring, Howard Carter's father put those bells together so that London heard it through the war, hears it today. All comes from the Howard Carter family. Howard Carter himself was a very strong intellect, but he'd gotten saved and gotten into the Bible and got into the things of the Spirit. And he is known as the one that taught the full gospel church the 9 gifts of the Spirit. What you and I teach and believe about the 9 gifts of the Spirit comes from this man, Howard Carter. World War I was happening, and they were drafting young men all over Great Britain, and Howard Carter got a notice that he needed to sign up and be ready to go to war. And he goes, no, I don't want to kill the Germans. I like the Germans. I got good German friends. I don't want to go to war. So he was a conscientious objector. They said, well, then you have to go to a prison or a work prison kind of place. And he goes, can I take my Bible with me? And they said, sure. He says, well, then I'll go there. So he worked during the day as a prisoner that had hard labor. And then at night he would read his Bible in the little cell where he was at. And all 9 gifts he learned and saw operate while he was in prison. All 9 gifts, he learned that they were something supernatural, because some people believe like this, that, the word of wisdom was Solomon because he was real smart. That's not what the word of wisdom is. The working of miracles is different. So God gave him a download, gave him a revelation on the 9 gifts of the Spirit. And one afternoon, God came to him in London and told him about a young man that was coming to help him and to travel with him and to assist him. And that young man, we Lester Sumrall.